All right. Hello. Good evening. This is the second week of the Embracing the Alienation book study. Couple of things very quickly. I would love to hand over the who does this introductory piece, and we can kind of maybe share that around a little bit. Anybody who kind of wants to do it. It's the kind of 10-15 minute bit at the beginning to summarize the chapter. Just a chance to hear other voices than me. Um, so it's going to be a couple of weeks before we come back to this book, but I want to put that out there, want to share it around. If anybody in particular would be interested in doing that. I was actually thinking, Tim, you are very well versed in McGowan and these ideas. I don't know if you're there in or just lurking, but would you have any interest in doing the summary of chapter 3?
Well, I'm interested. Whether I can do it justice remains to be seen, but I'll do what I can.
Brilliant.
Actually, I was going to say when you were talking about people's interest in this book, I'm reading it obviously for the second time, and it's even coming to life better than the first time, which I guess is pretty standard stuff. But sure, I'll do that.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Yeah, and I feel the same. I'm reading it for the second time, and God, like a good book, it's annoying actually, because it means you can never read a book once. And as John knows, reading Lacan, you could read him 10 times and you're getting new stuff every time. So it's you can't just read a book and go, oh, I can move on. Good books kind of almost demand to be returned to. Um, so I will do the kind of basic thing here, and then we'll open it up. And also, again, really want to encourage people to underline things that they particularly want to talk about, so that, when it comes to us talking more broadly, you kind of maybe have a paragraph or something that's particularly interesting to you and that we can all look at. So this chapter is interesting because it makes a really good argument. I love this argument, and it's not an argument I thought of. And I heard Todd talk about it one time on a podcast, and it completely made sense, completely right. I just had never thought about it before. That if alienation is something that is part of being a creature of language and a creature of desire. So let's, for argument's sake, say, okay, right, we're Todd's on to something, whatever. Then this is something that you will find in every culture at any time, anywhere in the world. But Todd makes the argument here that modernity has a particularly interesting relationship to alienation. It is a time in history where this alienation becomes very obvious in the art, in the literature, in the philosophy, in the economics. So it's like there's something about modernity that brings to light this universal dimension in a way that was probably previously not seen. Obviously, there are times when alienation manifests in different ways, but something about modernity really brings it to the fore. And he's saying, again, that argument is made by some people. And often what happens immediately when that argument is made, that's a critique of modernity. They go like, okay, this is the problem with modernity. Modernity brings alienation to the fore, makes us kind of disconnected from each other, from the world, from God, whatever it is. And there's an attempt to kind of overcome it. But again, what Todd is doing here is he's going like, actually, this is one of the few things that I think modernity is really good at, is it exposes something that, and we can't put the genie back in the ball. That's how I read this. And if anybody else wants to read it differently, tell us and jump in. But in this introduction, going like, it's almost like the genie's out of the ball. Now, I want to give an analogous example of what I think he means. Um, and I don't know if I talked about this last week. I definitely talked about it in the Fundamentalist podcast, which is going to come out soon, where I was talking about drive. And, in terms of drive, we can think about that very basically as the enjoyment we get out of a type of failure. So, we desire things, whatever objects, but drive is more connected to some sort of failure to get. And drive is very connected to alienation, right? These are interconnected topics. And it's interesting that it's only in the 20th century where really very sophisticated 19th and 20th century sophisticated reflections on drive really kind of come to the surface, because there's something potentially in modernity that is, that really shows drive for what it is. And one way of thinking about this, I think, economically, again, simplifying perhaps, but in feudalism, you could not really hook drive, right? In feudalism, you were born a farmer, you died a farmer, you made leather bags, and you were able to make 10 leather bags in a week, or a month, let's say, actually 10 leather bags in a month, and you sold those and you made a little bit of money and you bought stuff, but you could never really make 100 leather bags. Right, you just weren't able to. You might have some artisans, some like people working with you, but you could never kind of like, so you could never become a capitalist. Basically, you just kind of got enough. Some people did better, but it was only with industrialization where you could make a chain of people and you could make, thousands of leather bags. And obviously Adam Smith talks about this in terms of the famous pin example, that one person to make a pin would take months. You have to dig into the land to get the material, you have to purify it, you have to mold it, you have to sharpen the edge, you have to do all the stuff. So to make one pin would take you a month, but with industrialization and you have lots of people doing one little part, 100 people can make 10,000 pins. So it's the same kind of thing. It's like, it's almost like, it's not that drive didn't exist in feudalism. It's just that it didn't really have a chance to breathe. But with industrialization, you go, oh, of course, then you can start to be attached, not to the objects that money can buy, but you can start to get attached to the abstract increase of money, which wasn't really an option before, right? So that's just one example for me of how, and dating apps, I think, is a really good example, where, dating, you want to get the object, which is the person. You want to date in order to find the person. But there's a certain sense in which dating apps now, you can get a certain enjoyment just by flicking right and left, right? You start to get enjoyment not from getting the relationship, but from this frenetic pursuit without ever getting the relationship. And again, it's not that that didn't exist previously, but technology has allowed for a certain manifestation of drive. One other example, very quickly, maybe a better example, is classic book of the 20th century was Paul Tillich's The Courage to Be. And, he makes the argument in that book that's similar to Todd, that this kind of lack manifests itself in different ways at different times in history. And Paul Tillich's argument is that you go back far enough and death was the primary anxiety, right? There's death and disease everywhere. You had kids who died. I guess if you had 10 kids, 5 of them would be die. I have no idea about the real numbers, but you had a very high infant mortality rate. You didn't have a very long life, a lot of illness. So death was a real anxiety. And then he talked about kind of move forward to, I guess, maybe the, 14th, 15th century, whatever. Guilt became a predominant thing. We can think of Luther, who was kind of like the guilt that he was involved in. There was kind of like the lack manifested itself primarily in guilt. And then Tillich's argument is in the 20th century, its main manifestation is in meaninglessness, this sense in which life, we are alienated, we do our jobs, we're like little cogs in a wheel, we're kind of worthless and all of this. And Tillich, basically, his argument, again, similar to McGowan's, is modernity has brought out a particularly subjectively strong sense of alienation that we see in the arts, we see in the literature, we see in philosophy. And existentialism is a perfect example of a philosophy, a sophisticated philosophy that takes very seriously alienation. And then McGowan says what happens then is you will get reactive philosophies that want to try to overcome this. And he very, I think, interestingly picks Heidegger as the example. And I'll finish with this. I'll just say that with Heidegger, and I was a bit of a Heideggerian in my youth, as most continental philosophers have a Heideggerian phase, but Heidegger, he had a very most famous thing that Heidegger is known for is this distinction between the ready to hand and the present at hand. So Heidegger is a difficult thinker. Being in Time is a pretty difficult book, but in Being in Time, he makes this distinction which gets to the heart of something. And he uses the example, I think, of a carpenter with a hammer. When a skilled carpenter is using a hammer, they're not really aware of it. They're just using it. It's almost like an extension of their body. They're working. They're almost like kind of they're immersed in their work. They're immersed in their activity, and they're a being in the world. And that's what ready at hand is. The hammer is ready at hand to be used. But if the hammer breaks, then the carpenter will look at the hammer and will become very aware of it as an object. And that's present at hand. And Heidegger basically makes the argument that the more primordial way of being in the world is ready at hand. Where even driving a car, whenever you know how to drive a car, you almost don't know how you get from A to B. You get in the car and you just drive. Once I drove and I ended up somewhere I didn't even know. I was lost in my thoughts and ended up in the countryside. I was like, how did I get here? It's like it was ready. The car was ready at hand and I drove for like 30 minutes, not knowing where I was. That's kind of ready at hand. And Heidegger says, well, philosophy makes everything present at hand. It's almost like we think that that's the way we are in the world, but that's alien. We're alienated when things are present at hand. We're distant from it. We're distant from the world. Where that's fine, but it's not the basis of human being. And he uses the word Dasein to describe this: a being there, that we are a being in the world, first and foremost, and our alienation is secondary. And I guess that's probably why Heidegger never saw himself as an existentialist. But what's interesting about McGowan is he doesn't pick an easy target, like people can go, oh, the Nazis or something like that, right? Or reactionary, but he kind of chooses a really good philosopher. Like, Heidegger was he was a Nazi as well, but he was a great philosopher. And Todd says, this is an example of an attempt to escape the alienation that modernity exposes. But in this chapter, he is attempting simply to say, well, let's try not to cover it over. Let's try not to avoid it. Let's try not to do the reactionary move. Let's, in a sense, celebrate that modernity has exposed alienation to us in a very deep, albeit painful way. Okay, so that's kind of my reading and a summary of the chapter. Anybody else want to jump in with something? John, were you leaning forward there? No.
I think we should start off with a few positive things before I play my part as the.
Okay, yes, we'll do that. We'll jump in with Tim, but yeah, keep the negatives. I'm excited to hear you. Tim, jump in.
Well, I was just thinking about some of your examples you were giving of drive,
and
in from a Christian context, how people experience this drive towards actually the drive itself being more of the experience than whatever you obtain from the drive. And I want to just bounce these out there to see what you think. I think the pursuit of heaven is one of those where you don't really want heaven, but what you got to do to get there is giving you joy, whether that's church, Bible, whatever you think is going to get you there. Because in my opinion, heaven's going to be in what most people define as heaven. It's going to be a huge disappointment. It's going to be like getting the car that you always wanted. Now that you got it, then what? I think it's the process of getting there. And of course, there's a lot of underlayers to that, in my opinion. Things like Bible reading. You don't really want to master Bible reading. You just kind of want to say you've read it.
Yeah.
or kind of looking through it. Prayer, I think, would equally fall into that experience. People don't know how to pray. Prayer is a very mysterious experience. But to say you've spent 15 minutes in prayer gives a joy, no matter what the result was. It was the experience. I was just kind of toying with that a little bit in my mind. Wondered what your thoughts were on some of those specifically Christian expressions of drive.
Yeah, I think those are great examples. And those are examples of how drive maybe manifested at different epochs and different times. You did remind me because of what John said earlier about reading Lacan, is that I think that one of the enjoyments of reading Lacan is like the Bible, is you never master it. It's and I think sometimes that's why Lacan is writing in this ocular, difficult, obscure way, because sometimes it's almost to mimic the Bible. Like you don't kind of master the Bible. You have to keep, if you, exactly what you said, if you could master it, you'd lose interest very immediately. But something about the text in its failure to ever grasp the final interpretation is what generates the enjoyment. So yeah, I do love that example. Yeah. Greg, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was going to kind of take it in a slightly different direction, so I didn't know if anybody wanted to comment on that first.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah, any other thoughts on Drive and what Tim was saying? Anyone jump in? Otherwise, go for it.
No, I was just going to say, in terms of when you read something like the Bible, let's say, and you see something new, I think it's a mistake to think, oh, yeah, the Bible has everything that, it has a complete description of life. If we just read it again, we'll see more of life. I think what happens is we live life in between reading Bible or Lacan, and then everything we experienced, it's read into Lacan, or Lacan, the Bible says, oh yeah, well, that thing that happened at work, let me tell you about, Myers and this. So it's not just that we just read it and get something new. It's because hopefully we live a life outside of the readings.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'd like to respond to what Tim said with Drive. And you going back to, I just recently reread, Peter, your book, Idolatry of God.
Oh yeah.
And I read it quite some time ago. So rereading it, it was interesting how 15 years or however long it's been. I think it was 2003 when you put that out.
Oh yeah.
Can't remember, but how differently I looked at it. So in there, you mentioned this drive like a zombie, that there's something like we can be like a zombie in our drive, that's what's left, right? Once we die, is that drive is still there. And when I was thinking of the Dacian in light of that, it's very interesting when you relate that to dissociation. And I can see what Heidegger's trying to do there, because dissociation is kind of both. It is escaping, but it is also looking at yourself subjectively. So it's safe to say that it can be both. And that when McGowan says that alienation can only be genuinely emancipatory when we recognize it, is it that when we recognize that we're dissociating, that we are more able to be emancipated by our alienation?
Okay, so that's interesting, because like my initial thought on disassociation is sometimes that's what happens to a person whenever their anxiety or their alienation is too much, and it's kind of like a defense against that experience. But I like how you're describing it, because are you kind of, whenever someone disassociates, they're kind of split. So is that what you're kind of getting at?
Yeah, well, there's like with dissociation, there's disassociation, which is to go out, like to be separate from, and dissociation is to separate from within. And so in psychology, the term that psychologists use is dissociation, not disassociation. There's a difference.
Oh yes,
so
that's very good.
This is interesting too. Yeah.
Yeah. Is that different from, because depersonalization? That sounds like what I would call depersonalization, or is that another different one? Or is that
yeah, depersonalization is and derealization are under dissociation. And
yes,
that's two ways that you can dissociate. So you can be outside of who you are, or you can be outside of where you are. So that's the differentiation there. But what I've noticed, especially in doing some work around depressive realism, dissociation becomes very interesting, because it's almost like we are unconsciously trying to help ourselves to see ourselves more clearly by depersonalizing or derealizing. So this is where it's almost in a superposition. And I love this. And so this is what I think Heidegger was getting at, was he was toying with that and still staying within a black and white by saying, oh, it's just dissociating, it's derealization, it's escaping reality, right? But I would argue that it's in a superposition, and it can actually be helpful to move outside of yourself if you are aware, as McGowan's saying, then you are making it an emancipatory thing. You are able to move outside of yourself, of your time and space, and take a good look, alienate from yourself, take a good look at yourself, and be more aware of what's going on.
Okay.
It can collapse into that state, or it can collapse into just an escape.
That's very interesting. No, I like that. I'm rethinking, because as I said, my initial thoughts are, that those experiences are what the body does to kind of protect themselves. But actually, I like what you're saying, that they can open up an experience of alienation. So yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah, and like Tim said, that drive, it is interesting, because if we're in that zombie state, I think we are dissociating. The drive is still there, but we aren't aware. And when we're aware we're in that zombie state, then it can be emancipatory. So that's just repeating it, but that's what I thought of as Tim was talking about. It relates, right? Or
Yeah.
maybe I'm just relating things that aren't related. I don't know.
Oh yeah, no, it's great. I fascinating, because I find that derealization, disassociation, those concepts very psychically interesting. What's going on there? I've got a good friend who experiences derealization on a regular basis. So yeah. Does anybody else want to comment on any of that stuff, or Greg, you want to take us in a different place? Go for it.
All right, yeah, that was all really good stuff. I wanted to point out something, and I guess I'm going to kind of, I related to this book kind of personally more than I maybe expected to, and I guess I'm going to be slightly vulnerable here and talk about how there's this sort of cognitive dissonance that's happening between what I'm reading and what I'm experiencing in my life. So, he talks a lot about, this is sort of where he begins to critique place, and the idea that, the way that we have a tendency to kind of, maybe use place, as I belong here, or I belong to this group or this identity or this location, whatever, as a way of retreating from our alienation. And he sees this ultimately as potentially like fascistic in a way, and ultimately a problem. And the thing is I find that argument very compelling. I completely agree with him. But then at the same time, in my personal life, I'm struggling with it, because I guess, the older that I get, the more that I feel this urge to, like, I want to go buy a farm somewhere, away from people, and live there and have some kind of more authentic existence. I live in like a kind of a suburb where all the houses are exactly the same, and I find it very like painful almost to live here. But I also realize that kind of retreat into place might be problematic. I'm a historian by profession, and so I totally get why people get really into genealogy, or really deeply into their history and identifying with, maybe cultural heritage and things like that. But again, there's this, but I guess what I'm saying is I find this point of place to be really kind of inviting and alluring, and I'm finding myself having to push against that in my life. And I'll say this last thing, even thinking about like COVID lockdowns, right? There was a part of me that found like comfort in that, in some ways, of being told like, okay, this is where you can be and can't be, right? As opposed to the absolute anxiety of, because in Todd McGowan's podcast, Why Theory, there's one episode where they talk about that. And Ryan Angley brings up being in the supermarket and there being stickers telling you where you can stand, and about how there's something that is sort of anxiety easing about being told where to stand, because normally we don't know where we belong. right? And so I guess what I'm saying is, to summarize what I'm saying is, Todd is ultimately saying that there's emancipation in not knowing where you belong.
Yeah.
And in my own personal life, I'm fighting against that because I find that very anxiety inducing. Anyway, thank you.
No, that's a great example. During COVID, which, all of us found hard at different times, but you hit on something that I found not hard, which was, instead of not getting invited to parties, I knew the parties weren't happening. Like there was something about, it's not fear of missing out. It's like, oh no, there's not something I'm missing out on, because we're all missing out. And there was something quite a lane of anxiety in that. And you also remind me of, again, this move to the trad move, which I know lots of people have done, seems to be, a way of going back into a tradition that tells you lots of things about what you can and cannot do, that does allay anxiety that potentially is part of the modern world that just exhausts us. Here, as a historian, what do you think of his argument that the modern world has a unique kind of like bringing forth of this alienation? I mean, is that...
Yeah, so honestly, I found that pretty fantastic as well. That, I mean, I think there's a few things in here that he's really making a contribution to a lot of different literature, and he kind of just puts it out there and then moves on. And I'm like, wow, he's actually making a pretty profound point about modernity. Because I'm not somebody who I'm not a postmodernist. I never really got interested in sort of the postmodern arguments about modernity, but also have obvious critiques of modernity. And I think that this feels right to me. This idea that like modernity really decenters the subject, and that's a good thing. The problems of modernity came when people tried to overcome that alienation. So perhaps it's not modernity itself, but it's the flight from modernity that created many of the problems that we saw in that era. I find that argument to be pretty compelling.
Yeah, I do too, but which is why I'm excited to move on to John here, who's always a very insightful questioner of these positions. So yes, let's hear from you, man.
Oh no, so now I'm gonna have to defend post-modernity here a bit. And right, it's kind of a vague term, so it's difficult sometimes to pin it down. I guess, look, I have the opposite reaction to Greg, because for me this feels wrong, and I think he's getting something fundamentally backwards. It's not that I don't agree with a lot of the movements, and it's not like I don't agree that subjectivity is alienated, but I very much struggle to draw a distinction between this and what modern liberal ideology is. That is, if I actually try to draw the distinctions between these two, I don't see how this is a philosophy of the radical left as opposed to just a deepening of kind of a liberal ideology. I mean, look, I can use a specific example from page 44. I think it's 44. It's the first. I don't know if you have actual pages, if you have a digital edition.
Digital.
It gets screwed up. There's
Yeah.
a passage. There's a paragraph that starts. It's my 44, and it says, historically, societies offered speaking subjects an image of themselves that fit the traditions those societies maintained. The belonging that characterized the pre-modern world might have given members of that world relative peace of mind about their status in it, but in doing so, it deprived them of the singularity that stems from the emergence of the speaking subject. Subject's singularity is inextricable from its status, is alienated both from its social milieu and from itself. Paradoxically, it is only through being distanced from itself that the subject can be most itself. One arrives at singularity only by giving up the lure of belonging. Okay, now, as we talked about previously, right, being deep in the weeds of Lacan, I'm thinking of metonymy and sort of the effects of signification a lot lately. And it seems to me like, what if you just replace the term singularity, which a lot of people in philosophy seem to be using now, and just plugged in individuality? Like if you plug individuality wherever it says singularity or freedom, it almost reads like it's a liberal sort of just bourgeois philosophy. If you kind of just inserted these things, I guess my problem with the way that he's conceptualizing this is that it's basically just doing the liberal critique of tradition, and the relationship to the symbol and the signifier isn't very much different than sort of that general tradition. Like that the other is always the bad guy, that it's society that oppresses us and we need to deglue ourselves from these silly superstitions and tradition. I guess from a postmodern perspective, it seems like the argument would be that there's actually no escape from that symbolic system, so that you always sort of, to a certain extent, find your realization in the symbolic. I think this is the thing that Greg was talking about. It's like there really is a paradigm distinction between the modernist and the postmodern, and I think these are at, like, I don't go all the way down with the postmodern in the sense that I think that everything is linguistic truth, and depending on what you mean by postmodern, but at least the mentality of, can we kind of escape our symbolic determination versus the modernist idea that we can find some more genuine individualism. I think for me the problem is I detect too much of that in this. Like it's just like it's a preference, and it's a deep philosophical distinction, but that's where I keep running into problems.
Jeff was nodding away to some of what you were saying, so there's a bit of a mutiny here. So, Jeff, do you want to just jump in on the back of that, or?
Similarly, I think what he's doing is number one, edifying, but number two, really difficult. For reasons I think that John's kind of hitting on, or at least are triggering those reasons in my head. I've worked in the labor movement for over 20 years, and it's all about solidarity, right? And there's definitely, we've got a lot of easy answers in the labor movement for certain things. If only people did this, if only people did that, class consciousness, etc. But one of the things I'm noticing in the book is sort of, how do you build solidarity around this? I mean, any political project, I feel like that's going to have to be a part of it. And I don't know that it's impossible. And I'm not even saying he's wrong. I just think it will be a very difficult project, because it's hard. It will be hard to build solidarity and get this sort of group activity together that would be necessary when we're talking about singularity and the alienation of the individual. It seems to me it's going to be a difficult task.
Mm-hmm. Was John going to jump in there? No, one thing on that, just, have you read ahead at all? Because it'll be interesting to see when he talks about the commons, whether you think that is his attempt to kind of create a solidarity, not based on identity, but I'm not sure.
Ahead. I've been sort of skipping ahead. Yeah. And, when he talks about Marx, he talks about alienation and Marx's identification, which is early Marx, in my understanding. He doesn't talk about exploitation. He doesn't talk about some of those other things. But that sort of like is feeding into some of my concerns about. But I look forward to reading about what you're talking about.
Yes, I don't necessarily think you'll find it convincing, but just when you were talking, going like, oh yeah, because he will try to address solidarity. It'll be interesting to see how we feel that goes.
Well, there's also a very weird dimension to this, and it's an unspoken assumption in the chapters and the entirety of his argument, but it's almost as if there's either a binary choice between being attached to the signifier and being identified with our cultural milieu, and being separated from it as the singularity. And I really don't think that's the choice, because, like, my problem with the thinkers of the far right, people like Alexander Dugin and Alain de Benoit, is that they think that you can sort of just have this unalienated, they wouldn't phrase it that way, but let's just stereotype kind of their arguments, that you can just kind of merge with the ethnic community or find some kind of people, and that's a problem. But McGowan seems to be going to the opposite extreme, saying once you enter modernity, you just have like no connection to your culture, your people, or your political ideology or something like this. And like, isn't it a matter of degree, and isn't it a matter of quantity, in the sense that I would definitely agree, and this is why I like the argument of alienation, is that you are always separated. You can never actually merge with the symbols that define you, but you're not unattached to them. And it's a matter of it's a matter of distance and it's a matter of degree. It's not a binary choice. Like maybe we need some distance from our own symbolic identification, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't feel symbolic identification pervading us. Like it doesn't mean that we shouldn't have any sense of home or any sense of belonging. It's not an either or choice.
No, I agree with you. The funny thing is, I think of McGowan as saying, "I'm sorry, Greg, jump in. You were going to say something there. You
Yeah,
might
so
say
I
the
was just
same
going to
thing as
say
me."
that, yeah, I don't think that that's really McGowan's argument. I definitely don't think that he would want to break it down to like a binary like that. And I also don't think McGowan's ultimate goal is to try to champion some kind of singularity. He says in earlier, I don't remember exactly which page it's on, but he recognizes that you can't escape the social symbolic. I don't think he is advocating some kind of like transcendental, like you escape the social. He recognizes that it's always there and we're sort of constituted by it to a certain extent. But I think his argument, at least as far as I understand it, is that, you know, we have to try to, I guess, not give as much weight to those social identifiers and instead kind of find our way of identifying with the sort of fundamental alienation that we all share. It's not about like finding some kind of, perfect singularity escaped from the social. At least that's how I understand it.
Like, yeah, because I like John the way you said it, but I would say that I feel that Todd's trying to say that, which is we never identify with who we are, and the non-identity is the self-alienation drive. So if you got rid of one, if you go to one pole or the other, that's an attempt to escape alienation, because the alienation is precisely that you are not who you are. And in a way, that's the inescapable dimension of human subjectivity. But so
maybe I could
Oh,
maybe
jump
I
in.
could help from a social psychology standpoint. So there's differentiations even amongst belonging. So like the famous social psychologist Brené Brown says, the opposite of belonging is fitting in. And so it's a very interesting way to dissect belonging. Like you can feel like you belong by fitting in, or you can really belong. So maybe that can help with this argument a bit, because I agree with you, John. There was something a little off there for me as well.
Yeah. John, do you want to jump back in on that as well?
Well, I'll just say
Back on the
very
ball.
quickly. I mean, I guess this is why I said I think it's kind of a liberal argument, because it's almost as if, well, we people in the West who have our own autonomy and who have kind of our own singularity, like it's very much this conception of, well, we might have ethnicity, but ethnicity is the thing that we do when we go to parades, and we like, at least it's a little different in Europe for those of you who are from there, but like in the United States, we kind of treat Italian identity or Irish identity or all these different cultural identities as if they're things that we kind of just parade out when it's a holiday like St. Patrick's Day or something. And I very much detect this sense of identity throughout the text. It's a very American. I think Todd McGowan's American, right? If I'm not mistaken. So maybe some of that is bleeding through. But I detect that sense of this is how identity is being understood, because it comes from a culture that imbibes these values and it's our signification. But to then say that all these other cultures, whether Islamic, whether Asian, Indian, Chinese civilizations, who take their culture and their values and their symbolic worlds a little more seriously than we do, to say that they're somehow anti-modern and kind of not realizing the truth of the subject, I have a little difficulty with that sort of, like, I'm like, in a certain sense, I'm of course Eurocentric because these are my values and that sort of thing. But like from a global perspective, there's something that doesn't quite sit right here. It's just like, are the only people who don't take their values and their culture seriously, that's like the white people who live in kind of the West, and we're the enlightened ones who then know the secret of the subject, and everybody else is kind of just mired in pre-modernity. And that's kind of a little bit of an unsettling argument for me.
Well, when you say it like that, that's quite a powerful argument. I have to think about that. That's very well said. Very disturbingly said. I'm going to have to think of a response to that. I'm sure others will, but we'll let Chris jump in anyway, and then anybody who has a good response to John, I'd like to hear it, because that was
This is not a response to John.
yeah, no worries.
One thing that's been sort of crossing my mind during reading part of this chapter, I haven't caught up to where the end of the chapter is yet, but was the funny story kicking around when I was at uni, which was of a lecturer who goes into a lecture theatre and says, "Good morning." And he does this to 3 different groups. The physicists say good morning back to him. The mathematicians ignore it because it isn't mathematics. And the philosophers form groups and discuss what he meant by that.
Yeah.
And I was then thinking about the old maxim, the unexamined life is not worth living, to which I always did the rejoinder, and if you're spending all your time examining your life, you're not living it in any event.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay. I mean, I think of all this alienation stuff in terms of Doug Hofstadter's idea of the strange loop, and that we are essentially feedback loops or sets of feedback loops. And when you are being self-referential, you are probably inevitably producing paradox. Gödel made great use of that, but there's Russell's paradox and all that jazz. And then I thought about the term that I think Augustine coined on the back of Paul, but which Luther then expanded on, incurvatus in se, that is referencing yourself all the time. And Luther thought that that was the basis of sin. I'm looking at all this stuff that Todd's saying, and he says we have nowhere to be at home. I'm at home now. I'm perfectly content with being at home now. Yes, I feel slightly disconnected from almost any group that I'm involved with, but at this very moment, I'm not doing the self-examination bit as I'm going through this. I'm just sort of being. And it seems to me that the tendency to self-examine to that extent probably is a function of modernity, starting with Luther. And I'm not entirely certain that it's that fundamental to what humanity is, but I could be wrong.
That's very good points. I do want to kind of I kind of almost want to say that you are a great example, however, of Todd McGowan. You know, for 2 reasons. One is you're part of groups where you're at home in your alienation, like you're very at home in not agreeing with the groups that you agree with. So, and then the second one is I just heard today that you're part of Philosophy Portal. So you're saying about, you know, too much examination and going like that's hardcore stuff. So to be part of Philosophy Portal. So I was accusing you of being a performative contradiction, but in the nicest possible way. Bill, do you want to jump in?
So it's a really challenging book. Second time for me as well, primarily because I didn't understand much the first time. It's a hard book. And so I'm not going to try and make a broad claim, but does this make some sense? Like if I bring Sartre to our discussion, the thing that Todd seems to be saying is relying on an identity or saying, well, because I'm this, then I know what to do. It's kind of like the Sartre cheat. It's like, well, I have to kill that soldier because, I'm a soldier and my captain, I have to obey my captain. And so I think both of them are sort of saying, no, you actually have to do the hard work. You have to actually think and make a decision and not just reference a Republican or Democratic platform. And the example he gave was capital punishment. And he says, well, it sort of depends, right? And I can't just say, oh, because I'm pro-life, always against it, or because of this identity, that group always says never. He says, I don't know, it really depends. And, so you have to do the hard work and you can't just sort of do these, here's a misuse the word, short circuits, right? To just say, well, because I'm this, therefore I know what the answer is. I don't actually have to think. All I have to do is just remember, oh, I'm part of this group and this group told me to do this. So so that's, I think it's very smart to say, you actually can't just rely on much of anything. Nothing is given. You're going to have to. But my question is, why are people anxious? Why is this maybe something that was a learned behavior? That if we don't know something or we're not certain about, I'm wondering if it's something that religion or something in the past sort of infect us with, like, well, if you don't know something, you be anxious, right? And if you're not certain, or if you don't have a home, be really anxious. And why is it not the opposite? Like, most people, some people are really happy to be in a prison, but most people I know would like the opposite of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, by the way, I think the Sartre thing is very good, just because as well Todd is avowedly influenced by Sartre, and I think that exact thing you're talking about condemned to freedom, the Sartrean idea that
Right.
you mentioned, is that in a way we can never rely on our identity as a way of escaping our responsibility. I think that's very much Todd. So I think that's very, very good. I also wonder, and I'll just throw this in for a second in relation to the question you're asking, is if, like, the reason why there might have been less anxiety in other epochs, but other worse symptoms, which I think you're touching on, which is like, it's not like it was a brilliant, but is because it was a little bit like what Greg said about COVID. Like, whenever we were in COVID and most of us didn't have opportunities to do things, that caused lots of symptoms and lots of difficulty. But I wonder if it allayed for a lot of people anxiety, only because you were almost experiencing in a very tiny way what people in the past have experienced, or people in the present who don't have as many decisions as we do. Like, every day you go into a supermarket and you have 50 decisions about what pasta you can have. So there's something about the modern world that has so much decision making. Is that connected to why there might be said that anxiety is a very modern symptom?
I think 50 pastas is bare minimum. The bad one is in LA. You go into the supermarket and there's one, maybe two aisles of bottled water choices.
Yeah. I mean, that's a brilliant. John, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to build off, I think, of that and what you said to to Chris's response, and giving him a little bit of a hard time about how he's alienated from his sense of belonging. See, I guess this is why I say I think, like, I understand the paradigms. I think most people are stuck in this way of thinking, at least most of the philosophy coming out of continental philosophy for the last 20, 30 years has been thinking in this way. But right from the very beginning, the game is sort of set up as if there's this completely solid and ironclad symbolic order that controls everything and says everything, from which we have to break from. And I don't think that's really necessarily ever the case. Like, right, this is what the like it's true in a certain sense, but it's also wrong and pernicious in a different sense, because thinking that like there's, well, the pre-modern and there's the modern and there's maybe a radical break between the two. Like you're imagining that people in, you know, pre-modern society just, I don't know, accepted their feudal fate or something, and they didn't make fun of their lords, and they didn't question any religious conceptions, and they didn't, you know, they didn't sort of push back against these signifiers, the symbolic order at all. I mean, the way that we speak about these things, I think, is a little bit broken. I think it's a little bit incorrect. It's like, you know, you talk about how society creates us as gendered subjects or something, and there's right conceptions of what it means to be masculine, there's conceptions of what it means to be feminine. But the way that we speak about it is like the symbolic order gives us one cookie cutter position that we're to take up, and there's only one way to do masculinity, or there's one way to do femininity. And I think the truth is very much different for that, because society gives us an entire host of different ways to be masculine, different ways to be feminine. And I think what needs to change is to stop viewing the symbolic order as just this scary monolith that kind of exists over above us, and actually recognize that it in itself gives us room for difference and divergence and kind of disjunction. I don't think it's correct to kind of posit just the negativity of the subject against the symbolic order like this is being done. I think there's a lot more disjointedness within this relationship just in itself.
Very good. Greg, you want to respond to that particularly? Then you can jump in, and Courtney will come to you after.
Yeah, sorry, this was like really good. And John, I totally get where you're coming from. But I don't know. I don't know that McGowan thinks of the social or the symbolic order as being sort of monolithic. If anything, again, and I'm kind of, he doesn't say this in the book, but my understanding, and feel free to correct me, but I feel like McGowan might say that the reason why there are a bunch of different ways to be masculine or be feminine is because none of us can be masculine or feminine. Like identity, he's not saying that like identity is bad, the social order is bad, immoral. It's just that it always fails by its very nature. We can never be identical to those things. And ultimately, politics and life so far, we are where we are because we keep trying to find ways to be those things, and we ultimately can't. So what he's saying is that emancipation may only really be able to come when we are able to sort of stop trying to be self-identical with those things and identify with the alienation instead of trying to find various ways to overcome it. At least that's just my interpretation.
Yeah, you're saying very good stuff, John. There's about a couple of the things I hear you say that I'm like, I read, same with Greg, I read it, I think I actually read Todd in the same way as you're saying, but there's a couple of things you've said where I've gone, oh yeah, that does feel that there's a difference. And the two things that you said in particular that I go, cause me to have to think are one, other societies that are more embedded in certain symbolic structures. Is there a sense in which this is privileging, you know, a certain kind of modern Eurocentric kind of view? So I want to think about that. And then the other one, which where you said that in feudalism, was it really that different? And I think Todd would disagree with you there, and I struggle with that because I actually think there is something different, but it is. But you're saying something there I have to think about. So those are the two things that I feel in particular are pushing against McGowan. The other stuff, but I think you say very well, but I see in McGowan, I could be wrong, but I kind of go, oh no, I think, you know, the same with Greg, that I just see it as him saying no, the symbolic order just feels in itself, it's not that we shouldn't fully identify or whatever, it's just that we can't, but that can't has become more evident in the modern world. But John, do you want to quickly respond to that before we jump on to Courtney, or we'll get Courtney and you can think about it for a minute?
Well, I can just say very quickly, and this is the one time I'll be Hegelian,
Mhm.
is right. Hegel's reading of kind of individualism is that individualism is merely one more product of the social symbolic system. I think it's like midway through Phenomenology of Spirit. He basically makes the argument that there has to be a social system in place in order for the individual to take up the position that it is. So one of the things the postmodern argument would be, or kind of a Lacanian symbolic argument would be, that we kind of fool ourselves if we think that that individualism gets to the truth of some kind of raw subjectivity, because all it is a social symbolic insistence that you have to be unique, that you have to be singular, that you have to distinguish yourself. But that is in itself a product of our system of signification. It's one more superego injunction.
Mhm. That's very good. Brilliant. Well, here, Courtney, great to see you. I hope you're feeling a bit better. But jump in.
I am, I recover a little bit and then something else goes wrong, and then I recover a little bit and then it's just one thing after another. So I have not finished chapter 1 yet. I read Todd in a desperate attempt to understand what he's talking about. So it's slow going, but what all of you are talking about made me think of what he says on page 29, that any attempt to root subjectivity in its natural being will end up justifying social inequality, even if this is not the explicit intent. And in the margin, I wrote, the purpose of a system is what it does. No matter what kind of system we set up as humans, the purpose of it is whatever it ends up doing, whether that was what we intended it to do or not. So, I mean, that, I think somebody could write a whole book about that, and maybe somebody has, I don't know. But the original reason I put my hand up was in regard to what Bill said. The question of, why do people have anxiety? And for someone like me who has been in treatment for anxiety for years, and is currently experiencing a severe uptick in anxiety because I had COVID so severely, and I'm having a really hard time trusting the world outside my front door right now. I look at the world around us and I say, why don't you have anxiety? What's wrong with all of you people that you don't have anxiety? And it as I think about it, for me, the core of it is that in spite of all the things I've been learning through talking to all of you and reading Pete's work and reading other philosophers in the last few years, intellectually, I get that we all have a lack, and that is part of the DNA of the universe, and that I share in that. But there is still this core part of me that rebels against that concept. And I think that's a lot of where my anxiety comes from, is that there's part of me that is still expecting things to just kind of fall into place where I can be safe and not experience this anxiety. And then I look at other people around me and they're not doing things that I know would contribute to me getting this perfect safe space. And that is a lot of where my anxiety comes from. I mean, even leaving brain chemicals aside. And it's the same with approaching like Church of the Contradiction. And, I'm eager for that to really get going because I want to know how to do the thing. But that's part of me wanting someone to tell me what to do instead of embracing the fact that I am condemned to freedom. And it is a constant back and, one day I'll be like, okay, I can completely embrace this. I'm on board with it. And then the next day I'm like, no, will someone please take me by the hand and lead me into this, because I don't know what to do and I don't know where I'm going. And that's where a lot of the anxiety comes from, is just this inability to accept that there is a lack. And, you know, part of that is just part of the lack of being human is it not being able to accept that you have a lack. But then we also have all the systems of the world around us that are constantly telling us we should not have a lack. And, you know, so once again, I look around at everything and I'm like, how can anybody not be anxious?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure a few people can I relate to this. I mean, in that I know this theory, obviously, I've been doing it for years, and I feel like, but at a deep level, I still resist it. And part of the reason why I do psychoanalysis is because it's all very well knowing the theory. It's all very well reading books, and sometimes that can help. I'm sure you've experienced sometimes, yeah, it's been helpful. Yeah.
Sometimes being able to put a name to something really does lessen the symptoms.
Yes.
But it doesn't fix it.
But it doesn't fix it. It's still there's still this really hard work.
Yes.
It's so frustrating.
Yes.
Yeah. Does anybody else want to jump in on that? Resonate with that? I saw Greg was nodding his head as well. But yeah, no, I appreciate you saying that.
I read this really beautiful little book by a nun, and I can't find it on my shelf. I was trying to find the quote, but I'm sorry, I'll have to remember it off the top of my head. But she was talking about the difference between a monk who says they have peace, but they live in a monastery, and the monk that can be outside of the monastery and still have peace.
Yeah.
And the difference between those two things. And I think that differentiation is really good. And I think, Courtney, that yes, it's true. The appropriate response to life is anxiety. It's pretty brutal. That's pretty normal. And everyone feels it, some more than others, because different people have different nervous systems. So you're trying to challenge yourself to regulate your nervous system so that you're not so impacted by what's going on outside of you. And that takes incredible courage. So I really empathize with you in that. And I think you're definitely on the right track with looking at the realities of that, and then figuring out how am I going to normalize my body to facing those things. And instead of looking to a safe place to find them, like the monastery, I literally want to be in streets in New York and be just fine. Right? So keep heading there. It's great. I also just wanted to make a quick response to Greg when you mentioned cognitive dissonance. I loved that. And cognitive dissonance is the disconnect between what we think about ourselves and who we actually are. And that's a tough place to be in too, right? But in counseling and therapy work, the job of the therapist is to walk people into their cognitive dissonance, because the higher your cognitive dissonance is, the more likely you will change your behaviors, not just your beliefs to support your fantasy. So you're also in totally the right place, right? You're feeling this cognitive dissonance. And sometimes we want to run from that. We don't want to look at it. We want to get back to what we know or build another fantasy. But, you know, leaning into that cognitive dissonance is really good, because it just opens us up to whole new possibilities of living. So yeah, just happy to be a part of this group and the genuineness of everybody. I really love it. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you. I think, yeah, cognitive dissonance, I think it's a great psychological term that actually fits very neatly into what Todd's talking about, actually. So I didn't hear Greg mention it there, so I'm glad you brought it up, because I think that's a term that closely connects with this idea of alienation, because it's almost the experience of us living in a kind of contradiction. Kate, or Bill, whoever it is, I think it might be Kate. And then just letting you know, it's 7:10. So anybody else wants to say something, stick up your virtual hand and we'll go a quick round. Kate.
I'm in the middle of a really weird cognitive dissonance alienation moment. I apologize for disappearing for long swathes of this talk. I found out at the start that my ex-husband's grandmother died this week. And technically she's no one to me. Technically, I'm not related to her. I share no blood with her, but I was married to him for 10 years. She was my grandmother. I lived with her for many years. And it's so weird that he told me by telling me that my children's great grandmother died at some random point this week. He didn't say random point, but I don't know anything about it. And yet, like, I haven't spoken to her for several years now. But I feel really weirdly bereft that she's not in the world, even though yesterday she wasn't in the world and it didn't affect me in the slightest. But knowing that she's not suddenly makes a big difference.
And you just discovered this at the beginning of this call?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Oh, my goodness.
So thank you, John. I don't even know if my condolences like are appropriate. Like I don't even know if I'm supposed to. Well, I'm assuming it's okay to feel something. I'm human, but like, what is the correct protocol for an ex-grandmother-in-law? It's a very bizarre, long, complicated string of conditionals on a relationship. So it's very alienating because I am outside of the grief structure. There is a strict protocol, well, a very clear protocol for the grieving family, but I am not part of the grieving family. And yet I have feelings from my time with her. And so it's very strange to kind of work this process that has obviously only just started in the last hour, but to try and work out where that works and to suddenly not feel part of the group of people who have nothing to do with her, but not feeling part of the family that are feeling something and feeling like I'm kind of in that in between.
Yeah. And it'd be fascinating to talk about, and maybe after this in the next couple of days, but what she symbolized for you, like what, because the feeling you're having, there's obviously she has a symbolic place in your life and in your past life, and there must be a lot of emotion around that. That's just coming up that you wouldn't be aware of until obviously this has happened. So
And wasn't expecting, yeah. It's surprising how emotions do that.
Yes, yeah.
There's lots of research, Kate, around what's called ambiguous grief. And so there's lots of people that have been in your position. For example, sometimes people have affairs and, sometimes one of the people dies, and then the person who's in the background, who is the mistress or the, can't grieve with the family. So it's called ambiguous grief. You may want to just Google that a bit and see if that helps you work through some of what you're experiencing.
But anyway, that was sort of on topic.
Yes.
Slightly not.
Oh, well, thinking about you, and we'll chat about it as well. But yeah, I'm interested in, that just will bring up a lot from that time in your life. I mean, you said you lived with her for a time. I mean, yeah, okay, yeah. I'm sorry. Well, with that, then that's a place maybe we should end instead of jumping into some final abstract thing about alienation. Thank you everybody for being part of this, and for I love it when it takes a more personal tone, which Courtney brought us into, and Kate, you brought us into there. So I appreciate that, because it gets very heady whenever I'm doing these things. So next week is me doing a seminar, I think. And so it'll be a couple of weeks. What's that, Kate? Oh,
No, this is one of those months that has an extra Sunday.
Oh yeah, which actually usually I would just do the book study, but because my retreats are starting, I don't know if we should do that. So a week off, and then I will see you the week after that. But all right, thank you everybody. Have a great night. Bye bye.